When my father had a stroke, my mother promised she'd never leave his side. But that night, she did. And nothing in our family was ever the same again. You ever have one of those mornings that starts out so ordinary, so painfully routine, that you never realize it's the day your life is about to split in two before and after? For me, that day was 6 months ago. It was a Wednesday morning. Dad was making coffee. Same as he had every day for as long as I can remember. He always got up before Mom, humming some old tune while the coffee brewed, reading yesterday's paper like he hadn't already read it twice. But that morning, he didn't make it past the kitchen. Mom found him around 7:30 a.m., lying on the floor next to the counter, the mug shattered beside him. She told me later that she thought he'd just slipped until she saw the way his face drooped, the way his right arm wouldn't move. The paramedics said it was lucky she found him so fast. If she'd slept in, even 30 minutes more, he might not have survived. That was the day my dad had a stroke. The doctors explained it carefully how the left side of his brain had been affected. They used calm voices and diagrams and reassured us that recovery was possible. But the truth hit fast. Dad could walk, but only short distances and only with a walker. His right arm was weak. Buttons became impossible. Opening jars? Forget it. Speech was mostly okay. But when he got tired, the words would start slipping away mid-sentence. And the worst part? The confusion. Sometimes he'd forget his medication. Sometimes he'd stand in the kitchen, holding a spoon, completely blank, not remembering what he was doing there. He could still shower. But someone needed to be nearby. He hated that. Dad was a proud man, worked as a mechanic for 40 years. Built everything himself. The idea that he needed help to step into a shower? It killed him a little, but he tried. God. He tried. The physical therapist came twice a week and said he was doing remarkably well for someone his age. Instead from the DAF. With United Valachens. It's acted Witterweight in the Dallas. He'd walk up and down the hallway every morning, gripping that walker like it was the last piece of control he had left. He'd sit in front of the TV doing arm exercises while watching the morning news, pretending it didn't exhaust him. By afternoon, he'd always fall asleep in his chair. Before the stroke, my parents had this rhythm to their lives, quiet, predictable, comfortable. They'd been married 44 years. Every morning, coffee and crosswords. Every night, Jeopardy and light bickering over who got the answers right. Winters were for Florida. Same condo every year, same group of friends who'd known them since the 80s. They weren't flashy or dramatic, just steady. Reliable. Mom had been a secretary for the local school district until she retired at 62. Dad retired 3 years later. They'd earned their peace, you know. They'd worked their whole lives for that little house in the suburbs, their routines, their comfort. I thought they'd have that forever. When Dad came home from the hospital, Mom stepped up like a hero. She learned everything, the medications, the physical therapy routines, how to use the shower chair and grab bars. She rearranged the bedroom so Dad's walker could fit. Moved his favorite chair closer to the TV so he didn't have to walk so far. She even learned to puree food and cook softer meals for him. She didn't complain. Not at first. I came by twice a week. And every time, she'd say the same thing. We're managing fine. And for a while, it seemed like they were. But little cracks started showing. She started mentioning how much driving she had to do since Dad couldn't anymore. Then it was how tired she felt. How she missed going out with her friends. At first, I thought that was normal. Caregiver burnout happens to everyone, right? But I had no idea what was coming. Last Wednesday, 6 months after Dad's stroke, I came over for dinner, same as always. Something felt off. The second I walked in. The air was heavy, tense, like the house itself was holding its breath. Dad was cheerful, talking about his progress in therapy. Mom barely said a word. She pushed food around her plate and avoided eye contact. After dinner, Dad went to lie down like usual. That's when Mom asked me to stay a minute. She sat at the table across from me, hands folded, and said, "I'm done." I thought she meant she was tired. I offered to help, to come more often, to hire a home aide. But she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice flat. "I'm done being your father's caregiver." Just like that. No hesitation. No tears. She said she'd already called 3 care facilities. She'd already booked a trip to Italy with her sister Linda, 3 weeks in Tuscany. "Something I've always wanted to do," she said. She talked about looking at smaller condos downtown, where she could walk to restaurants and shops. I remember just staring at her. It didn't sound like burnout anymore, it sounded like escape. That night, I called my brother Mark. He lives 2 hours away with his wife, Jenny. When I told him what Mom said, he thought I was joking. We both remembered how Mom cared for Grandma when she had dementia, how patient she'd been. how she'd never once complained. She moved grandma into their home and cared for her until she passed. So what happened? How could the same woman who cared for her mother for years suddenly give up on her husband? When I went back over the next day, Dad was sitting in his chair, fumbling with the buttons on his shirt. Mom walked past without helping him. He looked up and asked if she was mad at him. She said, "No," and kept walking. I helped him button it. He smiled and said, "She's just tired." I didn't know how to tell him the truth. The hardest part to watch isn't her words, it's her face. She used to light up when he walked into a room. Used to laugh at his terrible jokes. Now, every time he drops something or takes too long to stand up, she looks at him like he's a burden. I offered again to help more. I said I could visit weekends, pay for an aide. She said she didn't want to manage anyone or plan schedules anymore. She wanted freedom. Her exact words were, "I'm 67 years old. I deserve to enjoy my retirement, not be tied down to someone who can't even dress himself." I didn't even recognize her voice when she said it. I reminded her of their vows, in sickness and in health. She said she didn't think that would actually happen to her, that she thought they'd grow old and die peacefully, like her parents did. Dad started asking me if I thought Mom still loved him. He noticed she doesn't sit next to him anymore when they watch TV. She used to hold his hand. Now she sits across the room, scrolling on her phone. He tries to tell her jokes, little things he sees on the news. She just mutters, "That's nice," without looking up. And honestly, I don't know what to tell him anymore, because I don't think she does love him, not the way she used to. That weekend, I called Mark again. We agreed to talk to Mom together to sit down as a family and figure out what was really happening. It didn't go the way we hoped. Mom was cold from the start. She sat with her arms crossed, eyes hard. Dad looked nervous, like a child called into the principal's office. Mark's wife Jenny was there too, 5 months pregnant, still nauseous, but determined to help. I started by saying we all loved Dad and wanted to make sure he was cared for and that Mom got the support she needed. But before I could finish, she cut me off. "You're missing the point," she said. "I don't want help. I want out." Mark asked, "Out of what?" She looked right at Dad and said, "I've been dead inside for 20 years. The room went silent. Dad's hands started shaking. Mark asked her what she meant. She said she fell out of love with him decades ago. Stayed only because it was easier. The house, the insurance, the friends. She said it was all convenience. Dad started crying, really crying, like I'd never seen before. He kept saying, "But we were happy, weren't we?" He talked about their trips, their dances, their memories. She didn't even blink. She said, "We had good times. That doesn't mean I was happy." Mark snapped. Called her selfish. Said even if she'd been unhappy. Saying all this now after his stroke was cruel. Mom shot back that she wasn't required to sacrifice her life for someone she didn't want to be married to anymore. She said she was done pretending. That seeing Dad now weak, dependent, made her angry instead of sympathetic. Then came the final blow. She said she'd already talked to divorce lawyers. She was going to file while Dad was in care, so she wouldn't have to deal with the emotional drama of living in the same house. Dad begged her not to. He promised to try harder, to get stronger, to be less of a burden. But she said, even if he fully recovered, she still wouldn't stay. The stroke didn't break their marriage, it just stripped away the illusion that there was one left. That night, I helped Dad get ready for bed because Mom locked herself in her room. He cried the whole time, asked me what he did wrong, asked if he could do anything to make her happy again. I didn't have an answer. Around 3 in the morning, I heard him crying again in the guest room. Mom was asleep, snoring like nothing had happened. And all I could think was, this is what love turns into when one person decides they're done carrying the weight. And maybe that's the part no one warns you about. The next few days felt like walking through fog. Mom barely spoke to anyone. Dad kept asking where she was, if she was mad at him, if he could fix whatever he'd done wrong, and I kept lying. "She's just tired, Dad. She needs rest." But inside, I could feel something breaking, not just in him, in all of us. Mom spent that whole week touring condos across town. She said she wanted a place that feels like mine. She left early every morning and didn't come home until evening. Dad would sit by the window with his walker, watching the driveway like a kid waiting for the school bus. He always looked relieved when her car finally pulled in. He'd ask if she wanted dinner, if she had fun, if she wanted to watch TV. Most nights, she just said she was going to bed. Then came Tuesday. That afternoon, I was in the middle of a work presentation when my phone started buzzing. It was our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She and her husband live 2 houses down from my parents. She sounded nervous. "I heard shouting from your parents' place," she said. "It doesn't sound right." I called Dad's cell. No answer. Then the house phone. Straight to voicemail. Then Mom. Nothing. Her phone was off. Something in me just knew. I told my boss it was a family emergency and ran out the door. 30 minutes later, Mrs. Henderson called again. Her voice was shaking this time. "I went inside," she said. I used the spare key you gave me. Your dad's on the bathroom floor. Well, okay now. Go in, follow what it said. By the time I reached the hospital, Dad was already in a bed, hooked up to monitors. He had bruises on his ribs and scrapes on his arm where he'd tried to catch himself. The doctor said he'd been on the floor for at least 2 hours. Mrs. Henderson, who's 74 herself, stayed with him the whole time, holding his hand while they waited for the ambulance. Dad kept apologizing to her for causing trouble. That's the kind of man he is. Lying bruised on a tile floor and still worried about inconveniencing someone. The ER doctor said it was a miracle. Nothing was broken, especially with his blood thinners. But they were clear. He couldn't be left alone anymore. He needed 24-hour supervision. And that's when Mom finally showed up. It was 7 p.m. She walked in like she'd just come from a shopping trip, which, apparently, she had. Arms full of bags, phone pressed to her ear, talking about deposits and floor plans. Dad's whole face lit up when he saw her. He reached for her hand, voice shaking, saying, "I'm sorry, honey. I didn't mean to fall. I'll be more careful." She gave him the briefest touch, fingertips, brushing his hand before pulling away. Her first question wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "How long will he have to stay?" "They're not sick. They Gabelin one rebraided." The doctor came back in to explain the situation, that Dad couldn't live alone safely anymore. He said it gently, with empathy, outlining care options, home assistance programs, and in the middle of that conversation, Mom's phone rang again. She held up a finger, "Sorry, this is important," and stepped out into the hall. That was the moment something inside me snapped. When she came back, she was still talking about the condo's square footage and natural light. I couldn't believe it. Dad was sitting there bruised, ashamed, terrified, and she was discussing countertops. I told her she was being heartless. She turned to me with this cold, empty stare and said, "I died the day you and your brother were born. I'm already divorced in my head. He's not my responsibility anymore." And then the sentence that will stay with me forever. She said she hoped Dad would die before she came back from Italy, so she wouldn't have to deal with long-term care arrangements. Dad heard every word. His eyes just emptied. He didn't yell, didn't cry. He just looked at the ceiling, like he wasn't there anymore. Mark arrived an hour later. He took one look at Dad and asked what happened. When I told him what Mom said, he completely lost it. He yelled at her right there in the hospital hallway, called her a monster, told her she was killing him. Mom said Dad was manipulating everyone, and that the fall was probably intentional, an act to make her feel guilty. Security had to step in. The nurse pulled the curtain closed, but I could still hear their voices echoing in the hallway, anger, disbelief, pain. Mom left without saying goodbye. Dad didn't speak for the rest of the night. When I tried to talk to him, he just stared straight ahead. The nurse told me sometimes stroke patients shut down emotionally after trauma. Watching your spouse wish for your death, she said, definitely qualifies as traumatic. I stayed until midnight, filling out discharge forms, calling agencies, trying to figure out where Dad could go. I called 3 home care services. The earliest anyone could start was a week away. The 24-hour rates? $300 to $400 per day, way beyond what insurance would cover. I tried adult daycare programs, but none would take someone who'd recently fallen. The waiting list for evaluations alone was weeks long. By 2 a.m., I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by empty coffee cups, realizing there was no safety net. Not for him, not for me. My boss called the next morning. She'd heard I'd missed the presentation. She said any more personal emergencies could affect my job security. I told her the truth anyway. She didn't care. Mark called too, but he couldn't help. His wife Jenny was having complications early, bleeding. Doctor ordered bed rest. He said he'd do what he could from home. Meanwhile, Mom texted me at midnight. She wrote, "Please handle your father's situation while I'm gone. I've arranged for someone to feed the cat and water the plants. He's the only loose end left." Loose end. She called her husband of 44 years a loose end. I didn't reply. The next morning, the hospital called saying Dad was being discharged. I had nowhere to take him. He couldn't go home. He couldn't come with me. My apartment isn't wheelchair accessible. I sat in the parking lot for an hour, hands shaking on the steering wheel, wondering what I was supposed to do. The world doesn't pause for tragedy. It just keeps moving, demanding decisions you're not ready to make. I called every number the social worker gave me. Waiting lists, paperwork, money. Always money. Finally, one respite care facility had a bed available, temporary, expensive, but safe. $400 a day. I signed the forms, handed over my credit card, and helped Dad settle in. He didn't protest. He just looked out the window and said softly, "She really went to Italy, didn't she?" I nodded. He looked at me, eyes glassy, and said, "Tell her, I'll get better, I promise." He still believed she'd come back, that if he just worked harder, healed faster, she'd love him again. I wanted to believe that too, even when every sign said otherwise. That night, I went home and sat in the dark. The house was silent except for the sound of the clock ticking. I opened my laptop and checked Mom's Instagram. There she was, smiling at a cafe in Florence, holding a glass of wine. The caption read, "Finally living for myself." And in that moment I realized, Dad had lost more than his health. He'd lost his reason to keep fighting. It had been 5 days since Mom left for Italy. The house felt emptier than ever, even though Dad wasn't there anymore. I was still driving to the respite facility every morning before work, then again at night after. I couldn't shake the guilt, the idea that he was sitting alone somewhere, wondering when someone would visit. When I arrived, he was always in the same place. His chair by the window, watching birds outside like they were keeping him company. He never complained. He'd smile when I walked in, ask about work, or if I'd eaten. But he was thinner. He'd pick at his food. He slept longer. He wasn't really there anymore, not like before. One of the nurses, a woman named Dana, told me quietly, "He's losing interest in everything." Then she said something I'll never forget. Sometimes, when people lose the person they lived for, their bodies just stop trying. I didn't want to believe that. But she was right. The second stroke. It happened early Sunday morning around 3 a.m. I woke to my phone vibrating on the nightstand. The caller ID said Sunrise Respite Care Facility. My heart dropped. The nurse's voice was calm but urgent. "Your father's been taken to the hospital. He's had another stroke." By the time I got there, he was in the ICU. This one, they said, was smaller, not as devastating as the first. But the doctor added, "It's likely stress-induced." He said words like hypertension, emotional trauma, systemic strain. But I didn't need the medical jargon. I knew exactly what broke him. It wasn't his body, it was his heart. The new stroke affected his speech. He slurred his words, forgot simple phrases. His memory slipped faster now. When I sat beside him, he'd grab my hand and whisper, "When's your mother coming back?" Informators would say first in South and by the red. Sometimes I'd tell him she was traveling. Other times I'd lie and say she'd call soon. I just couldn't bring myself to say the truth that she was thousands of miles away, eating pasta and taking pictures of sunsets. On his better days, he'd ask me to call her. Once, I did. She answered from Rome, her voice echoing like she was in a restaurant. When I told her Dad had another stroke, there was a long pause, maybe 10 seconds. Then she said, "Is he going to die?" When I said, "Not immediately," she sighed. "Well, I can't do anything from here anyway. Handle it, please." And then she hung up. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone. She didn't even ask which hospital, didn't ask if he was in pain, didn't ask if he was scared. I think that was the moment I realized something inside her was gone for good. Love doesn't vanish overnight. It withers, starves, fades, until there's nothing left. But whatever she used to feel for him, it was ashes now. The breaking point. I'd been on unpaid leave from work for 2 weeks. At first, my boss was sympathetic. Then she stopped taking my calls. Bills started piling up. Dad's care cost $400 per day. Insurance covered about 60%. The rest came out of my pocket. $160 a day doesn't sound like much until you're paying it every single day. I drained my savings first. Then my emergency fund. Then my sanity. One afternoon, standing in line at the grocery store, I saw a woman and her teenage son laughing while they picked out food for what sounded like a family dinner. They were debating whether to buy extra potatoes because Grandpa loves them mashed. That's when I lost it. I started crying. Right there, in the checkout line, people stared. The cashier froze. I mumbled an apology, left my groceries on the belt, and walked out. I sat in the car, hands gripping the steering wheel, thinking about driving away, just getting on the highway and never coming back. But then I thought about Dad. Sitting in that sterile room, waiting for someone who still cared. And I couldn't leave. Mark and Jenny. Mark tried to help from a distance. He made calls, researched long-term facilities. But when it came to actually visiting Dad, he couldn't do it. The last time I saw him, Mark said, he didn't even know who I was. I can't handle that. I understood, but it left everything on me. Jenny's pregnancy was getting worse. She was on strict bed rest after some bleeding. Mark was torn between being a husband and a son. Meanwhile, Mom was posting pictures from Italy, smiling in vineyards, sitting at oceanfront cafes, captioning them with things like, "Finding myself again." The cards. Mom sent postcards, generic ones. One said, "Having a wonderful time, wish you were here." Another, "The weather's beautiful. Tuscany is everything I dreamed of." Dad kept them neatly lined up on his nightstand. He'd show them to the nurses like they were proof she still cared. "She's just taking a little trip," he'd say proudly. "She'll be back soon." The staff never corrected him. They'd just smile and nod, because telling him the truth would have been crueler than the lie. Running out of options, the respite facility called me one morning. Dad had been there nearly 3 weeks, and they needed the bed for new arrivals. They said he had to leave by Friday. I'd been calling every facility within 100 miles. Most were full. The ones that weren't? $6,000 a month and insurance covered half. That meant $3,000 out of pocket. I did the math. I couldn't do it. Not for long. I thought about selling my car. About moving in with roommates again at 41. Every call I made felt like shouting into a void, a system that chews up families and calls it care. Thank you have not to again, which new down document. At night, I started drinking. Just a little. A glass of wine with lunch. A shot before bed. Not to get drunk, just to take the edge off. To quiet the constant ringing in my head that said, "You're not doing enough. You're failing him." The alcohol made it easier to deal with hold music, paperwork, insurance agents who transferred me from one department to another like a bad joke. I told myself it was temporary, but deep down, I knew I was starting to slip too. Mom extended her trip. She was supposed to come back last Thursday. Then she extended a week. Then another. Her Instagram caption read, "The Italian Riviera is so peaceful, I've never felt this free." Meanwhile, her husband could barely eat. He'd lost 10 pounds. He slept 14 hours a day. And every time I walked in, he'd smile weakly and say, "She's going to love the souvenirs I got for her." I didn't have the heart to tell him she wasn't coming back anytime soon. The hardest visit. One night, I arrived after work and found Dad sitting silently in his chair. Hands folded, eyes on the floor. The TV was on but muted. He didn't look up when I entered. I knelt beside him. "Hey Dad, it's me." He blinked, slow and unfocused. Then he whispered, "Did I do something wrong?" My chest tightened. "No, Dad, you didn't do anything wrong." He nodded slowly, then said, "Then why doesn't she love me anymore?" There are no words for moments like that. There's just silence, heavy, suffocating silence, and the sound of your heart breaking in slow motion. Friday deadline. The facility needed his bed. I found one that would take him, not perfect, but decent, clean, professional staff. Temporary. Again, I signed more papers, drained more money, and tried to keep my voice steady when I told him he'd be moving. He smiled and said, "Will your mother know where to find me?" "In the court in the plans, and Medi there will down. He will 217. And my planks." I said, "Yes, Dad. I'll tell her." He squeezed my hand. "Good. She worries about me." And in that moment, I wished I could hate her less. Because hate was too heavy to carry. But love? Love was heavier. That night, I went home and looked at her newest post, a selfie with a glass of red wine, captioned, "Finally at peace." And all I could think was, peace for one person had cost another his will to live. Mom came back from Italy 3 days ago. Not to the same house she'd shared with Dad for 44 years, but to her new condo downtown. She looked radiant, tanned, rested, hair freshly cut, like someone who'd just come back from a spa retreat. Not a woman whose husband was slowly dying in a care facility. She didn't visit Dad right away, didn't even call. She went straight to her condo to get settled, as if she'd just returned from a business trip. I didn't find out she was back from her. I found out from our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, the same one who found Dad on the floor that awful day. She saw the moving truck outside the old house. 2 full days of movers hauling furniture out, while Dad lay in a nursing facility, barely able to speak. Mom had sold the house, the home where we grew up, the home where Dad built every shelf, every fixture, every memory. When I told Dad she was home, he smiled. He looked so hopeful. He said, "That's wonderful. Maybe she'll come get me soon." I didn't have the courage to tell him she'd moved into a condo he couldn't even access with his walker. He's at Sunset Manor now, a skilled nursing facility that costs $8,000 a month. Insurance covers about half. The rest? That's on me. His room is small but clean, a hospital bed, 1 chair, and a window overlooking a small garden. On good days, he stares out at the flowers and birds. On bad days, he just stares at the wall. He needs help eating now. The second stroke affected his swallowing reflexes. He can't walk without someone holding onto him. Sometimes, he forgets people's faces. Even mine. But on his good days, when I walk in, his eyes still light up. He always asks the same thing. "Is your mother coming today?" I told Mom she needed to visit, at least once, at least to see what she'd done to him. She brushed it off, said she had errands, said she needed to finish unpacking. That's when I lost it. I told her if she didn't go, I would call Adult Protective Services and report her for spouse abandonment. She stared at me, cold as ever. Then said, "Fine." She showed up the next afternoon, and I timed it. She stayed exactly 22 minutes. When Mom walked into Dad's room, it was like the sun came out. His whole face transformed. He sat up straighter, reaching for her hand. "Linda," he said, his voice trembling. "You're back. Oh, thank God you're back." He started telling her about the postcards she'd sent, how beautiful they were, how kind the staff had been. He said he'd been worried about her traveling alone, but he was so glad she'd come home safe. Mom sat in the visitor's chair, scrolling through her phone, muttering short replies like, "That's nice," and, "Uh-huh." She didn't look at him once. When he asked if she was ready to take him home now, she said, "I'm living nearby." He would not be allowed. With his no water find at a tyrant's face. That's it. No warmth. No explanation. He didn't understand. He looked so confused, like a child trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing pieces. He asked why she didn't hug him anymore. Why she only visited for a few minutes. The staff tried to reassure him, telling him that families need time to adjust. But I could see it in their eyes. They knew this wasn't normal. This was cruelty disguised as detachment. Mark's marriage was starting to crumble under the weight of all this. Jenny was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and terrified that the stress would hurt the baby. She told Mark she couldn't handle any more family drama, that he had to choose between obsessing over our parents' situation or being present for his wife. He chose her. I don't blame him. But it left me completely alone in this mess. Every medical decision, every bill, every piece of paperwork, it all fell on me. And when I called Mark to ask his opinion about Dad's care, he'd answer in short, distracted sentences. Always eager to hang up. He couldn't even visit anymore. Said it was too painful. The truth is, I started to understand why people say caregiving breaks you. It's not just the physical exhaustion, it's the emotional decay. It's watching the people who should care the most quietly walk away, leaving you to carry the weight alone. My doctor prescribed antidepressants after I broke down in her office. She said, "You're experiencing caregiver trauma. It's not weakness, it's overload." I laughed. Because that's what it felt like, my whole life overloaded. Every morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach, thinking about bills, medical forms, phone calls, and Dad just kept asking when he could go home. He didn't understand that home was gone, sold by the woman he still called his wife. Mom filed for divorce officially. She also signed paperwork legally removing herself as Dad's healthcare proxy. That meant every decision, medical, financial, ethical, was now mine. She told me it was for the best. Said she didn't want to be emotionally manipulated into staying. Then she smiled and said she was planning a trip to Greece next month with her sister Linda. I just stared at her. "How can you plan another vacation?" I asked. "He had a second stroke. He can barely speak." She shrugged. "His medical condition isn't my responsibility anymore. You've got everything under control." I couldn't find words strong enough to respond. How do you argue with someone who's replaced empathy with self-preservation? Every visit to Sunset Manor felt like stepping into another universe, one where time had stopped, and kindness was the only currency that mattered. The staff tried their best. They really did. They played music from Dad's generation. They wheeled him out into the garden when the weather was nice. Sometimes I'd catch a flicker of the old hymn, the man who used to tell jokes at every family barbecue. But most days, he was quiet. He'd hold my hand and say, "Tell your mother I miss her." I'd nod and say, "I will." And then I'd cry in the parking lot afterward, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers went numb. The money situation got worse. I had to put $4,000 on my credit card last month to cover the gap between what insurance paid and what the facility charged. I'm one more emergency away from financial collapse. Mom, meanwhile, posted photos of herself sipping cocktails by the ocean with captions like "finally free." I can't decide which hurts more, her absence or her joy. Because somewhere deep down, a part of me still wants her to feel guilty. Still wants her to see what she's done, but she doesn't. She's moved on. And I'm left picking up the pieces of a man who still believes she'll walk through the door any day now. One afternoon, I brought Dad a framed photo, the one of him and Mom dancing at Mark's wedding. His eyes lit up. He traced her face in the picture with his finger. "She looks so beautiful there," he whispered. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Do you think she still loves me?" My throat tightened. I said, "Of course, Dad. She always will." He smiled faintly and said, "I'll wait for her." And I knew he meant it, even if it killed him. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, bills spread out like landmines, and realized something. Mom had built herself a new life. Mark had built himself a family. And I was stuck in the ruins, the caretaker, the daughter, the witness to the slow erosion of love. It wasn't fair. But grief never is. Dad's decline didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like watching a candle burn itself out. The flame shrinking a little every day until it's barely there. At Sunset Manor, the staff started using a term I'd never heard before. Failure to thrive. It sounded clinical. But what it really meant was that Dad had stopped wanting to live. He wouldn't eat unless someone fed him. He wouldn't participate in physical therapy. He just sat in his chair, staring out the window. Sometimes he'd whisper things under his breath, words that didn't quite form sentences, like half memories slipping through his fingers. The doctors ran every test, infections, heart function, blood work, but everything came back normal. His body was fine. It was his spirit that was breaking. One afternoon, the nurse pulled me aside. Her name was Maria, and she'd been kind from the beginning. She said, "Your dad's body can keep going for a long time. But people like him, when their hearts are broken, they stop fighting. It's not the stroke anymore. It's grief." I think that was the moment I understood what was really happening. Mom hadn't just left him, she'd taken the part of his will that kept him alive, and no amount of medicine could fix that. Then came the third stroke. 3 weeks after Mom's last visit, I got the call early one morning from the facility. The nurse's voice was calm, but trembling. "He's stable," she said. "But it's serious." By the time I arrived, he was barely conscious. The doctor said this one was different. It had affected his ability to swallow and his cognitive function. He needed a feeding tube now, and some days, he didn't even recognize me. On others, he thought I was a nurse or a volunteer. He'd thank me politely, call me miss, and ask if I'd seen his wife. The truth was, he was fading, not just physically, but mentally. The man who had built engines, fixed everything around the house, laughed so loud at family dinners he was disappearing into someone else, and I couldn't stop it. The medical team called a meeting. They said it was time to consider hospice care. The words hit me like a punch. Hospice, the place where people go not to get better, but to die comfortably. They said, it doesn't mean giving up hope. It means prioritizing comfort. But I knew what it meant. It meant that this was the end of the road. When we transferred him to the hospice center, I thought I'd fall apart. It was quiet there, peaceful, with big windows and soft music playing in the background. His room overlooked a small garden with bird feeders. He liked that. On his good days, he'd watch the birds and smile faintly. On bad days, he just stared at the ceiling, unblinking, lost somewhere I couldn't reach. The staff there were angels, patient, gentle, kind. They spoke softly when they entered the room, treated him with dignity, even when he couldn't respond. But the silence between his breaths grew heavier. The room started to feel smaller, like the walls were closing in around time itself. Mark started visiting again. Maybe it was the reality of hospice that there wasn't much time left. He'd sit beside Dad and talk about anything he could think of: work, sports, memories from when we were kids. Sometimes Dad would recognize his voice and smile. Sometimes he'd drift in and out, mumbling old song lyrics. Jenny came once too. Even though she was 7 months pregnant and struggling with back pain, she held Dad's hand and said softly, "If it's a boy, we're naming him David after you." For a second, Dad's eyes brightened. He smiled. The first real smile I'd seen in weeks. He whispered, "I hope I get to meet him." I think we all knew he wouldn't. Mom came once. I practically begged her, told her if she didn't visit, I'd make sure everyone knew she'd abandoned her dying husband. She showed up 15 minutes late, wearing designer sunglasses, and carrying a handbag that probably cost more than Dad's monthly care. He recognized her immediately. His whole face lit up. He tried to sit up straighter. Tried to talk. She didn't say much. Didn't even hold his hand. She just stood by the door, scrolling through her phone. I watched his expression change from joy, to confusion, to something hollow. When she left, I followed her outside. "Why did you even come?" I asked. She looked at me like I was the unreasonable one. She said, "Your father made his choices. I'm making mine. He trapped me for 40 years. I'm done being miserable." I said, "Getting a stroke isn't a choice." She shrugged. "Staying in a dead marriage was." Then she walked away, heels clicking against the pavement, like it was just another errand she could check off her list. After that, Dad stopped eating altogether. He slept most of the day. His breaths came slower, rougher, more uneven. The hospice doctor told me it could be days, maybe weeks. There was no way to predict. I spent every night there after that, sleeping in a chair beside him. I'd play his favorite old songs quietly on my phone: Sinatra, Nat King Cole, Elvis. On some nights, I'd swear I saw tears slip down his cheeks when Unforgettable came on. I held his hand and whispered stories about childhood, about when he taught me to ride a bike, when he built the treehouse, when he stayed up all night helping me with a school project. He never responded, but I think he heard me. I have to believe he did. Mom didn't call, didn't check in, didn't ask how he was doing. She texted Mark once to confirm that the funeral plans would be simple and inexpensive. Said she wasn't canceling her Greece trip no matter the timing. She actually said, "David wouldn't want me to interrupt my plans." Maybe she was right. Dad spent his entire life trying to make her happy. Maybe this was just the final chapter of that pattern, him dying quietly so she wouldn't be inconvenienced. I started planning my escape, not from him, from this life, from the grief, the resentment, the memories. I found a job in Portland, far away enough that I wouldn't run into her at the grocery store. Far enough that people wouldn't know the story. A clean start. Somewhere I could breathe again. But first, I had to say goodbye. I didn't know when that would be, only that it was coming soon. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Dad took his final breath. The hospice nurse said the early hours are often when the body decides it's ready. Quiet, still, between one breath and the next. I'd been dozing off in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand. The air felt heavy, like the whole room was holding its breath. And then, it just stopped. No gasp, no struggle, just silence. The nurse stepped in, checked his pulse, and nodded softly. "He's gone," she said. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I just sat there, staring at his hand in mine, warm for a moment longer. then slowly cooling. Mark was there too. He'd driven down the night before because the nurses said it could happen soon. We both cried, not the loud, dramatic kind, just quiet tears that fell without permission. After everything he'd been through, the strokes, the loneliness, the heartbreak, Dad deserved peace. And I like to think that, at least in those final moments, he had it. I called Mom at 8:30 a.m. She didn't answer the first time. When she finally picked up, her voice was calm, detached. "Mom," I said quietly. "He's gone." Which is now. There was a long pause, maybe 15 seconds. Then she said, "When's the funeral?" "No, I'm sorry." "No, how are you?" "Just logistics." I told her the funeral home could schedule a service on Thursday. That would give her one day between the burial and her flight to Athens. She said, "That works," and hung up. Just like that. The funeral was small, maybe 30 people. A few neighbors, some of Dad's old co-workers, distant relatives, and family friends who still cared enough to show up. Even Mrs. Henderson came, the neighbor who'd found him that awful day. She brought flowers, white lilies, his favorite. Mom sat in the front row, dressed perfectly in black, checking her watch every 10 minutes. The funeral director had to remind people twice to silence their phones. It all felt so impersonal, like everyone was just trying to get through it, like grief was something scheduled between errands. At one point during the service, the pastor started talking about devotion, about standing by loved ones through sickness and hardship. I saw Mom's jaw tighten. She crossed her legs, folded her arms, and stared straight ahead, expressionless. When it was over, people stood up quietly. Some cried. Some hugged me, or Mark. Mom didn't shed a tear. The burial was short too. Mark and I stood by the casket while the pastor said the final words. I could barely hear him over the sound of the wind and my own heartbeat. When the coffin lowered into the ground, I wanted to scream. Not out of anger, just out of disbelief that this was how it ended. After 44 years of marriage, after all the promises, all the mornings with coffee and crosswords, it came down to this. A quiet hole in the earth, and a wife already planning her next vacation. We had a small reception afterward at Mark's house. Mom said she was too busy packing to host it at her condo. About 20 people came back for sandwiches, coffee, and awkward small talk. Mom stayed for exactly 30 minutes. She thanked the guests, said she had laundry to finish, and left. That was it. Her husband had just been buried, and she left to fold clothes. That's when I broke. I stood up in front of everyone, my hands shaking, and said, "You're a selfish monster." The room went silent. Mom froze mid-step, staring at me like I was the one who'd lost my mind. "You destroyed Dad's last year of life for your own convenience," I said. "You abandoned him when he needed you most, and now you can't even stay for the reception? What kind of person does that?" Mom set her purse down slowly. "I did what any reasonable person would do," she said. "I arranged for his care. I made sure he was comfortable. I fulfilled my obligations." "Obligations?" I repeated. "He wasn't a job, Mom. He was your husband." She rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic." Jenny, bless her heart, spoke up then. She was 8 months pregnant, exhausted. But she stood up for me anyway. She said, "Abandoning your husband during a medical crisis isn't reasonable. It's cruel." Her voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "Even if you were unhappy, you owed him compassion. You don't just walk away because love got inconvenient." Mom crossed her arms. "You're too young to understand what 40 years of marriage does to you. You think love lasts forever, but it doesn't. People change." Mark's father-in-law, who barely knew our family, chimed in quietly. "I've been married 38 years, he said. "I can't imagine leaving my wife if she got sick. Marriage vows say in sickness and in health for a reason." Mom turned to him and said, "Vows are just words people say when they're young and naive. I fulfilled mine for decades. I've earned my happiness." The room fell silent again. And one by one, people started leaving. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was tragic. Everyone could feel the rot under the polite conversation, the truth that love had died long before Dad did. Mark walked her to her car afterward. I watched them from the window. They talked for maybe 2 minutes. He hasn't told me what she said, but when he came back in, his face was pale, his hands trembling. She drove away without looking back, and I knew that was the last time I'd ever see her as Mom. From that moment on, she was just Linda, a woman I used to know. 6 weeks later, I left for Portland. I got the job, packed up my apartment, didn't tell Mom my new address or my new number. Mark supported the move. He said I needed it. He stayed back to focus on his family. Jenny gave birth to a healthy baby boy, David Michael, named after Dad. When I visited a month later, Mark held his son and said, "I'm going to tell him who Grandpa really was, not how he died, but how he lived." That was the first time I smiled in months, because maybe, in that little baby, something of Dad could live on: the kindness, the patience, the quiet strength. Sometimes people at work ask about my family. I tell them my father passed away recently. They offer their condolences, ask if my mother's doing okay. I always say the same thing. She's doing fine. Then I change the subject. Because how do you explain that your mother went on vacation while your father died alone? How do you explain that love can disappear so completely, you can't even recognize the person you came from? You don't. You just build a new life around the hole they left behind. In Portland, I started therapy twice a month. It helps, I guess. But some nights, I still wake up thinking I need to check on Dad to make sure he hasn't fallen, to remind him to take his pills. And then I remember he's gone. Other nights, I dream of Mom, not the woman she became, but the one who used to make pancakes on Sundays, who danced with Dad in the kitchen to old jazz records. That version of her feels like someone from another lifetime, someone who died long before he did. If there's one thing this whole nightmare taught me, it's that love isn't always forever. Sometimes it fades quietly. Sometimes it rots beneath the surface. And sometimes, it's not the body that breaks first, it's the promise. Dad deserved better. He deserved a partner who saw him as more than a burden. He deserved a goodbye filled with warmth, not indifference. But life isn't fair that way. Love isn't fair that way. And yet if you asked me what I'd do differently, I'd still hold his hand that last morning. I'd still whisper, I love you. Because even if love failed between them, it didn't have to die between us. Portland didn't feel like home at first. It felt like a witness protection program, a place to hide, not to heal. New city, new job, new people who didn't know my story. For a while, that was exactly what I needed. No one here knew about my dad. No one knew about the woman who went to Italy while her husband was dying. No one knew how I spent a year watching love decompose in real time. They just saw me the new coworker. Polite, quiet, good at my job. They didn't see the grief pressed under my skin like bruises that wouldn't fade. I rented a small apartment near the river, with big windows that let in too much light. On weekends, I'd walk for hours, sometimes to escape my thoughts, sometimes to chase them. Portland's the kind of city where you can disappear in a crowd, and that anonymity became my sanctuary. The first month was hard. Grief doesn't clock out when you start a new job. It follows you into the office, into the grocery store, into bed. There were mornings when I'd reach for my phone, ready to text Dad just to check in, like I used to, and then I'd remember. He wasn't there anymore. Other days, I'd walk past an older couple holding hands, and it would hit me, this gut punch reminder that love doesn't always age gracefully. Sometimes it just stops showing up. Therapy helped, at least a little. My therapist, Dr. Hayes, had this calm way of talking that made silence feel safe. She told me something I've never forgotten. Grief isn't just about losing someone. It's about losing the version of yourself that existed with them. And she was right. The version of me that existed when Dad was alive, that version believed in stability, in vows, in the idea that love meant showing up. That version died the same year he did. I kept seeing flashes of the past in the smallest things. A man at the park struggling with a walker. An elderly couple arguing playfully over crossword clues. The sound of Sinatra in a cafe. It all brought me back to him. I'd picture Dad sitting by that window in the nursing home. The postcards lined up neatly beside him. He'd point to them and tell the nurses, "My wife's having a lovely time in Italy. She'll be back soon." They'd nod and smile because telling him the truth would have been crueler than the lie. Sometimes I wonder if kindness is just a prettier form of deception. Mark and I talked every few weeks, but we avoided the big stuff. He'd tell me about the baby little David, named after Dad. He'd send photos, the chubby cheeks, the tiny hands gripping his finger. One picture broke me. It was of Mark holding the baby up toward the window, sunlight spilling over both of them. He captioned it, "Dad would have loved this." And he would have. God, he would have. I cried that night not because I was sad, but because for the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't anger or exhaustion. I felt warmth, maybe even hope. Mom tried to contact me once through Mark. She said she needed my signature on some final paperwork related to the estate. I told Mark to handle it. She didn't push further. He said she didn't even seem upset that I'd cut her off, just mildly inconvenienced. Like she was trying to close an old account she'd forgotten she still had. Sometimes I imagine her in Greece, standing by the ocean, wine glass in hand, the sun setting behind her, completely at peace. And it makes me sick, because she got the life she wanted. Freedom. Silence. No one depending on her, and I got the aftermath. You don't realize how much care costs, not just in money, but in years. Dad's medical bills, hospice fees, travel expenses, they consumed everything. His savings were gone. My emergency fund was gone. I'm still paying off the credit card I used to keep him comfortable. I joke sometimes that my inheritance was debt and depression, but it's not really a joke. It's just the kind of truth you can only say out loud if you wrap it in sarcasm. Still, I'm proud of what I did, even when it broke me. Because when everyone else left, I stayed. When everyone else turned away, I looked grief in the face and didn't run. That has to count for something. There's a small cafe near my apartment. Every Saturday morning, I sit there with a cup of black coffee the same way Dad used to, and write in a notebook. Nothing fancy. Just thoughts. Letters to him. Sometimes. I tell him about the rain, the new job, the city lights reflecting on the water. I tell him about Mark's baby. I tell him that I'm trying to live in a world without him, and without the illusion of the love I once believed in. It's strange, but writing to him helps. It feels like sending messages into the void, hoping they find him somehow wherever he is. Sometimes I imagine what I'd say to Mom if I saw her again. If she walked into this cafe right now, wearing her travel clothes, that same calm detachment in her eyes, I don't think I'd yell anymore. I think I'd just ask, was it worth it? Was freedom worth watching a man who loved you die believing you'd come back? Was peace worth turning your children into caretakers of your guilt? Was happiness worth erasing 44 years of shared life like it was a typo? I don't think she'd have an answer. Maybe she never will. Grief is weird like that. It doesn't end. It just changes shape. It stops being a knife and becomes a shadow. You learn to live with it like an ache that flares up when the weather changes. Most days, I'm okay. Some days, I'm not. But at least now, I'm honest about it. I stop pretending I'm fine. Stop saying it's okay when it's not. Because if Dad taught me anything even in the way he died, it's that love without honesty is just endurance. And I'm done just enduring. The therapist once asked me what closure would look like. I said, it would look like my dad getting the ending he deserved. She nodded and said, and what would that look like for you? I thought for a long time. Then I said, it would look like finally forgiving myself for surviving it. And maybe that's what this is all about. Not forgiving her, not yet. Maybe not ever. But forgiving myself for still being here, still breathing, still living, still believing, against all odds, that kindness means something. The first winter in Portland was the coldest I'd ever felt. And it wasn't just the weather. It was the silence. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes even breathing feel too loud. I used to hate quiet the way it made me think. But now, silence feels honest. It doesn't lie to you. It doesn't promise that people stay or that love lasts. It just exists, steady and unchanging. Like truth. I filled the apartment with small noises to make it bearable. An old record player humming vinyl static. The faint clinking of dishes as I made coffee. The soft whir of the space heater. Little sounds that meant, I'm still here. I started lighting a candle every morning before work. Not because I'm religious, I'm not, but because it felt like a quiet conversation. Like saying, I remember you, Dad. And maybe, I'm still trying. The new job was fine. Not great, not terrible, just fine. My coworkers were kind in that distant, polite way people are when they sense you've been through something but don't want to make it awkward by asking. I liked that. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted normalcy. I wanted to be someone who ordered lunch and complained about deadlines again. Not the person with a dead father and a mother-shaped wound that wouldn't heal. Work was predictable. Predictable was safe. But grief is tricky. It sneaks in through the smallest cracks. A colleague once asked about my parents for a team fun fact exercise. I froze. Everyone laughed, waiting for my turn. I just said, my dad was a mechanic. He could fix anything. That night, I went home and cried harder than I had in months, because it hit me that there are some things even he couldn't fix. I started visiting a small used bookstore every Sunday. It was owned by an old man named Harold, who wore cardigans and smelled like dust and coffee. He never asked questions, just smiled when I came in and let me wander the aisles. There was a chair by the window that creaked when you sat in it. That became my spot. I'd spend hours flipping through books I'd never heard of, reading under the week afternoon Sunday. Harold would sometimes say, you remind me of my daughter. She used to come here and read like that. And I'd just smile. Because it felt like a small, harmless lie, that maybe I was someone's daughter again. One Sunday, I found an old poetry book tucked in the corner. Inside, someone had scribbled a note in blue ink. Sometimes the only way to honor love is to live better than your pain. I bought the book immediately. I keep it on my nightstand now. When the nights get hard, I read that line out loud. Like a prayer I don't fully believe in yet but want to. Therapy became less about grief, and more about rebuilding. Dr. Hayes started asking questions that made me uncomfortable, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She said, you talk a lot about your father's suffering, and your mother's betrayal. But what about you? What did all of this teach you about yourself? I told her I didn't want lessons, I wanted peace, but she pressed. Peace comes from meaning. So what did it mean for you to be the one who stayed? I didn't have an answer then. But later that night, sitting alone in the glow of the city lights, I realized, maybe it meant I was the kind of person who still believes showing up matters, even when it breaks you, even when no one thanks you for it. Mark called more often after the baby was born. He sounded different, softer, like becoming a father had rewired something in him. He told me how little David smiled for the first time, how he laughed when Jenny sang. Sometimes, he said, I see Dad in him. The way he looks at people, curious but gentle. That made me cry again. but in a good way this time, because it reminded me that Dad wasn't completely gone. He was still here in small gestures, in stories, in the way Mark had learned to hold someone carefully. I asked Mark if he'd talked to Mom. He said, once. She sent a card for the baby. What did it say? I asked. He hesitated. Then, just congratulations, nothing else. That wanted was Saul. The winter than with had not ne'er. I still think about her sometimes more than I want to admit. Not out of love or longing, but out of confusion. How does someone walk away from everything? How does a heart shut down so completely? Maybe it's easier than I think. Maybe you just stop caring one day, and it sticks. But then I remember Dad's face when she walked into that hospice room, how his eyes lit up, how his whole body tried to come back to life just for her, and how, in the silence that followed, something in him finally gave up. That memory keeps me from becoming like her. No matter how bitter, how tired, how lonely I get, I never want to lose my capacity to care. Dr. Hayes asked me once, if you could talk to your younger self, the one before the stroke, what would you say? I said, I'd tell her to hug her dad more. To really look at him. To memorize the sound of his laugh. She nodded. Then asked, and what would you say to your mother? I thought about that for a long time. Finally, I said, I'd ask her to tell me the truth earlier. Because pretending kills slower, but it kills deeper. I've started cooking again. Simple things: pasta, soup, pancakes. It feels domestic, comforting, like borrowing fragments of a life I lost. Sometimes I imagine Dad sitting at the table while I cook. He'd crack a joke about how much salt I use. He'd tell me Mom used to burn toast on purpose, so it would taste like home. I miss the way he made everything feel okay, even the things that weren't. One evening, after dinner, I went for a walk along the river. The city lights shimmered on the water. A street musician was playing the saxophone. What a wonderful world. I stopped and listened. The air was cold, the sound drifting softly, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel heavy. I just felt human. And I realized something Dad used to say was finally making sense. You don't get to choose how people love you. You only get to choose how you love them. He chose kindness until the end. And maybe that's the kind of legacy worth keeping. Not the pain, not the anger, but the quiet grace of still choosing love, even when it hurts. That night I went home, opened my notebook, and wrote, I stayed. That's my story. I stayed when she left. I stayed when it hurt. I stayed until the end. And somehow, I'm still here. Then I blew out the candle. The room went dark. But it didn't feel empty anymore. Spring came late that year. The rain in Portland finally started to ease. And for the first time in months, sunlight poured through my apartment window. It hit the kitchen counter just right, the same way it used to light up the breakfast table back home. Funny how grief works. Even light can feel like memory. I stood there one morning, coffee in hand, and realized I'd stopped counting the days since Dad's death. Not because I'd forgotten, but because grief had changed shape again. It wasn't a wound anymore. It was a scar. Mark called later that week. He sounded exhausted but happy, the kind of tired that comes from late nights and new life. David's teething, he said, laughing softly. He keeps chewing on my fingers like a puppy. I could hear the baby babbling in the background, Jenny laughing faintly. Their house sounded alive, warm, filled with the kind of noise I missed. Come visit, Mark said. He needs to know his aunt. I promised I would, and for the first time in a long while, I meant it. Before I went, I stopped by the little bookstore again. Harold was there. Same cardigan, same warm smile. He remembered my name. You've been quiet lately, he said. Trying to be, I replied. He nodded, like he understood more than he was saying. He handed me a small leather-bound notebook from the counter. On the house, he said. You look like someone who needs a place to put her piece. I didn't realize how much that sentence would mean until later. When I arrived at Mark's, it was like stepping into a parallel world, one where things had gone right. The baby's laughter filled every corner. The walls were covered in photos of moments that actually mattered. First smile, first steps, first messy meal. Mark looked older, softer somehow. He hugged me longer than usual, and when he pulled back, his eyes were glassy. He looks like Dad when he sleeps, he said. I smiled. Then he's in good company. That night, after the baby was asleep, we sat in the kitchen, same spot where Dad used to tell his stories. Same kind of warm light. Same kind of tired comfort. Mark poured us each a glass of wine. Then he said quietly, Mom called. My stomach tightened. What did she want? He hesitated. She's moving back. I didn't know what to feel: anger, curiosity, dread. Maybe all of it. Back where? I asked. She bought a condo near here. Said Greece was too expensive long term. He said it like a joke, but his face didn't match the tone. She asked if we'd have dinner with her next week. I laughed, too sharp, too bitter. Dinner? After everything? After she left Dad to die alone? Mark sighed. I know. But part of me thinks maybe we should. For closure. Closure? I repeated. She doesn't deserve closure. He stared into his glass. Maybe not. But maybe we do. I didn't answer him that night, but I didn't sleep either. I kept thinking about what closure even means. Does it mean forgiveness? Does it mean forgetting? Or does it just mean not letting the past own every part of your present anymore? Dr. Hayes had asked me once, what would forgiving your mother look like? And I'd said, like betraying my father. She said, no. It would look like freeing yourself. It is a no distal to no one. I didn't believe her then, but now, maybe I was ready to at least test the idea. A week later, I agreed to the dinner. Mark booked a quiet restaurant neutral territory. Jenny couldn't make it. The baby had a cold, so it was just the three of us. When Mom walked in, I barely recognized her. Her hair was shorter. She looked thinner, older. But her eyes, those same sharp, unreadable eyes, hadn't changed at all. She smiled like nothing had ever happened. Look at you two, she said cheerfully, sitting down. It's been ages. I stared at her, speechless. Mark tried to keep it civil, asking about her travels. Her new condo. She talked for nearly 20 minutes straight. About Italy. About Greece. About how transformative it had been to finally put myself first. Not once did she mention Dad. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I leaned forward and said quietly, do you ever think about him? She blinked. About who? Dad, I said. The man you left to die alone. The smile faltered just for a second, then came back, tighter this time. I don't see the point in dwelling on the past, she said. He's gone. What good does guilt do now? I felt my throat burn. You don't feel anything? She sighed. I feel relief. That's something, Mark muttered. Unbelievable. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. For a moment, no one spoke. The restaurant hum faded behind the pounding in my chest. Then, to my own surprise, I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just said softly, I forgive you. Her eyes widened. You what? I forgive you, I repeated. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry you anymore. She looked confused. Maybe even scared. Then she laughed. You always were dramatic. But for the first time, her voice trembled. I stood up. Mark followed. And as we walked out, I felt something shift, like a door quietly closing somewhere inside me. Not slammed shut, not locked forever, just closed. That night, I sat by the river again. The city lights shimmered across the water. The air smelled like rain and spring. I opened Harold's notebook and wrote, forgiveness isn't saying what happened was okay. It's saying it no longer owns you. And maybe finally that was true. 2 weeks later, Mom sent a text. Thank you for dinner. It read. No apology, no explanation. But for the first time in years, I didn't delete her number. Because maybe letting go doesn't mean erasing someone. Maybe it means remembering them without bleeding. When I visited Dad's grave that summer, I brought the baby. Mark stood beside me, holding him. The cemetery was quiet. The grass soft underfoot. I knelt down, touched the gravestone, and whispered, I think I'm finally okay, Dad. The wind moved through the trees like a sigh, and for the first time since that awful day in the hospital, I didn't cry. I just smiled, small, honest, steady. Because he'd be proud, I think, not of what happened, but of what I did with it, of how I stayed, of how I kept choosing love, even after watching it fall apart. Summer in Portland doesn't rush in, it lingers, cautious, like it's asking permission to stay. The air turns golden, the evenings stretch longer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't dread tomorrow. Grief, I've learned, doesn't vanish. It just becomes manageable, like learning to live with a scar that still aches when it rains. But there's a difference between surviving and living. And somewhere between those quiet mornings and the long walks home from work, I started to realize I was ready to live again. My therapist, Dr. Hayes, noticed it before I did. You're not waiting for the pain to go away anymore, she said one afternoon. You're learning to walk beside it. I smiled, half embarrassed. She was right. The anger had softened. The memories had stopped clawing at me in the middle of the night. And the silence, that heavy, unbearable silence, had become a kind of friend. I wasn't healed, but I was healing. One Friday evening after work, I went back to the little cafe where I used to write letters to Dad. The same table by the window. The same barista who always spelled my name wrong. But this time, I wasn't there to write about grief. I was there to write about beginnings. I started a list, just small things I wanted to do before the year ended. 1. Visit Mark and the baby again. 2. Take a weekend trip alone, not to escape, but to explore. 3. Donate to the hospice that cared for Dad. 4. Plant something. Watch it grow. 5. Forgive myself for still missing her. It wasn't much, but it felt like a promise. Around that time, I started talking to someone new, a coworker named Aaron. He worked in the IT department. Quiet, always reading on lunch breaks. We'd cross paths in the break room. exchange small talk that slowly became something gentler. He had this way of asking questions that didn't feel invasive, like he genuinely wanted to know who you were, not just what you did. One afternoon, he said, "You always look like you're somewhere else when you're quiet. Where do you go?" That were so ways, and that nos in arrays within my me. I told him the truth. Backwards, mostly. He nodded, like he understood. "Yeah," he said softly. "Grief's like gravity. You don't notice it pulling until you try to move." We talked about loss. His father had passed a few years ago too. Different stories, same ache. That conversation stretched into coffee after work, then weekend walks. Then something that started to feel like peace. I didn't call it love, not yet. Love still felt like a word with too much weight, too much history. But sitting next to Aaron by the river one evening, watching the sunset ripple across the water, I realized something simple but important. Not everyone leaves. Not everyone breaks you. Some people arrive quietly, see the damage, and decide to stay anyway. And for the first time in years, I let someone stay. Mark called again that weekend. He said the baby had started saying his first words, "Dada." I laughed so hard I cried. He sent me a video, the little boy clapping, smiling wide, eyes bright and full of trust. It hit me then. This was how life goes on. Not by forgetting the ones we lost, but by teaching the next ones how to love better. Dad would have adored him. And in a way, I think he's still here, in every laugh, every lesson, every quiet act of kindness that still echoes through us. A few weeks later, I visited the hospice where Dad spent his final days. I'd avoided it for so long, afraid of the smell, the memories, the sound of machines. But walking through those halls again, I felt calm. The nurses recognized me. One of them, Maria, smiled. "You came back." "Yeah," I said softly. "I wanted to say thank you." She asked how I'd been. I told her the truth, that I was still learning, still figuring it out. She nodded. "That's all any of us are doing." I gave them a small donation envelope before I left. It wasn't much, but it felt like closing a loop, because the last time I'd been there, I was drowning. This time, I walked out lighter. On the way home, I stopped by a garden shop and bought a small potted plant rosemary. Dad used to say rosemary was for remembrance. I put it by the window in my kitchen, where the sunlight hit in the mornings. Every time I watered it, I'd whisper, "Hi, Dad." It sounds silly maybe, but it felt like connection, like keeping a piece of him alive in something that kept growing. One night, Aaron asked me what scared me most now. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Not losing people," I said. "I've already survived that. What scares me is becoming like her, someone who stops caring when love gets hard." He reached across the table and took my hand. "You won't," he said. "Because people who fear that are the ones who never will." I didn't say anything back, but that moment stayed with me. Because maybe love, the real kind, doesn't announce itself with fireworks. Maybe it's just someone holding your hand and saying, "You're not her." I visit Dad's grave less often now, not because I've moved on, but because I carry him differently. He's in my voice when I comfort someone. He's in my patience when things fall apart. He's in the small, good parts of me that refuse to die with him. And every now and then, when the wind shifts, or a song comes on that he used to hum in the garage, I smile instead of cry. That's how I know I'm healing. The last entry in Harold's notebook reads, "Maybe forgiveness isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the beginning of who you become after surviving it." I wrote underneath it, "Then I'm finally beginning." By the time fall returned to Portland, the world felt different, or maybe I finally did. The city that once felt like an escape had quietly become a home. The streets I used to walk to numb myself were now just streets, normal, familiar. It's strange how healing sneaks up on you. There isn't a single day when you wake up and say, "I'm better." It happens in pieces, like noticing you went a whole week without crying, or realizing that a memory doesn't hurt as sharply anymore. One morning, I was halfway through brushing my teeth when I caught my reflection and didn't look away. I used to avoid mirrors after Dad died. It was easier not to face the person I'd become. But that morning, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but something quieter, a kind of acceptance that sits deep in your bones. Aaron and I were still seeing each other, slowly, carefully. He never rushed me, never demanded I move on. We'd cook dinner together, talk late into the night, laugh about small things. He wasn't trying to fill the emptiness. He was just sitting beside it. That's what I think love should feel like. Not a rescue, but a presence. Sometimes we'd walk by the river at sunset, and he'd tell me about his mom, how she planted wildflowers every spring, even after his dad passed. She said they're proof that beauty comes back, he told me once. That line stayed with me, because I realized that's what I was doing. Too, planting my own wildflowers in a life that had once been scorched bare. At work, things were finally steady. My boss called me into her office one morning to tell me I'd been promoted. I think she expected me to be more excited, but all I could think about was how I wished Dad could see it. He used to say, "You've got your mother's drive, but your heart, that's all yours." Back then, I didn't know what that meant. Now, I do. Drive without heart is just motion. And for the first time, my motion felt meaningful again. Mark visited with the baby that November. Little David was walking, wobbling, really, and saying a few new words. He ran straight into my arms when he saw me, giggling uncontrollably. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because his eyes, they were Dad's eyes. That same steady warmth, that same curiosity about everything. We went to the park, the three of us. The air was crisp, the leaves gold and red. Mark watched the baby chase pigeons and said, "You ever think about Mom?" I hesitated. "Sometimes, not as much." "She asked about you," he said quietly. "Wanted to know if you'd be home for Christmas." Home. That word still felt heavy. "I don't think I'm ready," I said. He nodded. "Me neither." We didn't talk about it again, and somehow, that silence said everything. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just neat handwriting on a plain white envelope. Inside was a short note. "I know you'll never forgive me the way I want, but I hope you live a good life anyway. Mom." I sat with it for a long time. No tears, no anger, just stillness. She was right. I would never forgive her the way she wanted, because what she wanted was absolution. And forgiveness isn't about freeing the person who hurt you, it's about freeing yourself. So I didn't reply. But I didn't throw it away, either. I folded it carefully and tucked it into Harold's notebook next to the page that said, "Forgiveness means it no longer owns you." That winter, I volunteered at the hospice where Dad passed. I wasn't sure I could handle it, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet beeping of monitors, but I went anyway. And it was beautiful. In a way I can't explain. I'd sit with patients who didn't have family, just talking, holding hands, reading aloud. Some would share stories, some just wanted company. And sometimes, when their breathing slowed and I realized they were slipping away, I'd whisper the same words I said to Dad that last morning. "It's okay. You can rest now." The nurses said I had a calm energy. I think it's just that I understood what silence meant. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Aaron started joining me on volunteer days. He'd bring tea for the staff, talk with patients about books, sometimes play old songs on his phone. The first time he did that, when Unforgettable played, I had to step out for air. But then something strange happened. I smiled, because instead of breaking me, it reminded me of the good parts, the laughter, the Sunday mornings, the way Dad used to hum along while fixing the car. Pain had turned into gratitude. Gratitude had turned into love. And love had turned into something softer, something that stayed. By spring, I had a rhythm. Work, therapy, volunteering, quiet weekends, no drama, no crisis, just life. One night, Aaron and I sat by the river again, our usual spot. He asked, "Do you ever feel like you've changed too much to go back?" I thought for a moment and said, "Maybe. But maybe that's what healing is, realizing you were never supposed to go back. Only forward." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Then let's keep going forward." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running away from something. I was walking toward something new. When I got home that night, I lit the rosemary candle on the kitchen counter. The plant had grown tall, reaching for the window light. I wrote one last line in Harold's notebook. Love didn't end. It just changed homes. Then I closed it gently, knowing Dad would have understood. I never thought healing would look like this: quiet, steady, almost ordinary. It's not cinematic. There are no dramatic breakthroughs or triumphant music swelling in the background. It's just one morning after another, waking up and realizing that the ache isn't the first thing you feel anymore. Some days, it still visits me. When I walk past a hardware store and smell sawdust, when a Sinatra song plays unexpectedly in a cafe, when I catch the scent of rosemary on someone's jacket, and my chest tightens just enough to remind me, he's gone. But I'm still here. That's the balance now. Grief and gratitude. Sharing the same space. Volunteering at the hospice became a permanent part of my life. It wasn't about repaying anything. It was about presence, about doing for others what I wish someone had done for Dad when I couldn't be there. There's one woman, June, who reminds me of him. 82. Frail but sharp as ever. She tells stories about her garden, her late husband, her 3 cats. She jokes that I'm too serious for my age. And sometimes, when I laugh, she squeezes my hand and says, "There you are. That's better." June doesn't know my story, and she doesn't need to, because sometimes connection doesn't require context, it just requires care. One day, the hospice director asked if I'd speak at a fundraiser, share my experience as a volunteer. At first, I wanted to say no. I hate stages, microphones, eyes on me, but something inside me whispered that maybe it was time to give words to everything I'd carried. So, I said yes. That night, I stood behind a podium, palms sweating, staring out at rows of strangers. I took a breath and began. My father spent his last weeks in a place like this. I thought I was here to watch him die. But really, I was watching how love can stay, even when life can't. I told them about the nurses, the music, the postcards on the nightstand, about how kindness isn't grand, it's quiet. It's showing up when it's hardest, and about how grief doesn't end, it teaches. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then people started clapping softly. Some were crying. One nurse hugged me after and whispered, "Thank you for saying what we all feel." I went home that night and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. Aaron was there that night, in the back row. Afterward, he wrapped me in his arms and said, "You were incredible." I said, "I was terrified." He smiled. That's what made it beautiful. We walked home in silence, fingers intertwined, and it struck me how peaceful everything had become. Not easy peaceful. There's a difference. Peace isn't the absence of pain, it's learning how to breathe through it. That winter, I took a trip alone, one of the things on my list, a small coastal town a few hours away. Just me, a camera, and the sound of waves. On the last morning there, I sat by the shore watching the sunrise paint the water gold. I thought of Dad, and Mom, and all the years between what was and what is, and for once, I didn't feel haunted by any of it. I whispered, "I forgive you," to the ocean. I don't even know who it was meant for, maybe her, maybe myself, maybe both. The waves took the words like they were never mine to keep. A week later, I got an unexpected email from Mom. No greeting, no subject line. Just 3 sentences. "I heard about your hospice speech from a friend. Your father would have been proud. I'm glad you're finding peace." I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no manipulation this time. No self-justification. Just words that almost sounded human again. I didn't reply. But I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there like an unopened door. Mark called that same night. He said, "Mom's been asking about seeing the baby again." I waited for the familiar rush of resentment, but it didn't come. "Do you think you'll let her?" I asked. "Maybe," he said. "For him, not for her." We talked for a while about life. About Jenny, about the way time softens everything if you let it. Before hanging up, he said something that caught me off guard. "You sound happy." And I realized he was right. Not ecstatic, not euphoric, just quietly, deeply okay, and that was enough. Aaron and I moved in together that spring. It wasn't a big event, no ring, no announcement, just 2 people choosing the same space, the same rhythm. He brought his books. I brought the rosemary plant. We built a home from small, simple things. Sunday pancakes, movie nights, shared silences. One evening, while cooking, he asked, "Do you ever think your dad would like me?" I smiled. "He'd probably make you fix something around the house first." Aaron laughed. "Fair. Guess I better start earning his approval then." I looked at him and said softly, "He already gave it. For like his radar when I doing sing better." At the hospice, June passed away a few months later. I was there that evening. She held my hand, looked at me, and whispered, "Don't stop loving people, even when they don't deserve it." Then she smiled one last time and was gone. The nurse beside me started crying, but I didn't. I just whispered, "Thank you." Because somehow, those were the same words I'd said to Dad. Loss will always come. But this time, I understood it better. You don't outrun it, you grow strong enough to hold it. That night, back home, I opened Harold's notebook again. The pages were filled, now grief, forgiveness, love, all tangled together. On the last empty page I wrote, "Sometimes life breaks you open so light can get in. And if you're patient enough, one day, the weight you carry turns to warmth." I closed it and placed it beside the rosemary plant. The city was quiet outside. Aaron was humming in the kitchen, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel like someone rebuilding a life. I felt like someone living one. By the time another year passed, I had stopped marking anniversaries. Grief didn't keep time anymore. It had folded itself into my days, still there, still real, but gentler. Like a quiet hum beneath everything good that had come since. The rosemary plant was still growing by the kitchen window. Some mornings, I'd crush a leaf between my fingers, breathe in its scent, and think, he'd be proud. That thought didn't break me anymore. It steadied me. Aaron and I had settled into a life that was soft and simple. No grand gestures. No promises made out of fear. Just presence. We'd go to the Saturday market, pick out bread still warm from the oven, walk home hand in hand, and laugh about nothing. And sometimes I'd catch myself in the middle of one of those moments just watching him talk. The sunlight flickering across his face, and I'd think, I made it here. After everything, I actually made it here. One evening, while we were cooking dinner, Aaron said quietly, "Your brother called earlier. He told me something, but he wanted you to hear it from him." Before I could ask, my phone buzzed. "Mark." When I answered, his voice sounded lighter than it had in years. He said, "Mom's sick." And then, before I could react, he added, "It's not serious." Early stage lymphoma. Treatable. He hesitated, then said, "She asked for you." The sad caved away reportin' himself. The words sat between us. Heavy and unexpected. It had been nearly 2 years since our dinner. 2 years since the last time I saw her face, cold and unreadable. 2 years since I'd said I forgive you and walked away. Part of me wanted to say no immediately, to protect the fragile peace I'd built, to say, she made her choices, let her live with them. But the other part, the quieter one that sounded a lot like Dad, whispered, "Go." So I did. The hospital room smelled the same as all of them do, sterile, faintly sweet, full of echoes. When I walked in, Mom was sitting by the window, wrapped in a thin blanket, her hair shorter than I remembered. For a moment, she didn't look like the woman who had abandoned us. She just looked small. She turned her head when she heard me. "You came," she said softly. "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted. She nodded, eyes fixed on the window. Neither was I. We didn't talk for a long time, just sat there, listening to the hum of the machines. Finally, she said, "I heard you volunteer at a hospice." "I do." "That's good. You were always the caretaker." The way she said it, tired, regretful, not condescending, made my throat tighten. Then she said something I wasn't ready for. "I think I hated that about you." I frowned. "What?" "The way you cared.